welcome to the Children's and Teen Health Summit. I'm your host, Carla Atherton, founder and director of the Lotus Health Project, lotushealthproject.com, where we empower people to get healthy and stay healthy in mind, body, and spirit, and on the social, global, and environmental levels. For this session of the summit, I am excited to be speaking with Ann Louise Gittleman, PhD, about electromagnetic fields and their impact on our children's health. Visionary health expert Ann Louise Gittleman, PhD, CNS, has always been a trendsetter. She has the uncanny ability to pinpoint major health concerns and provide solutions years ahead of mainstream medicine. Highly respected as the grande dame of alternative health and award-winning author of over 30 books, she single-handedly launched the detox diet revolution in her 2002 New York Times bestseller, The Fat Flush Plan, which spawned a series of 5 additional Fat Flush books and was featured in Newsweek. A Connecticut College and Columbia University graduate, she was recognized as one of the top 10 nutritionists in the country by Self magazine and is the recipient of the American Medical Writers Association Award for Excellence for her book Super Nutrition for Women. Ann Louise forged new ways of thinking about obesity early on in her career. She was the first to proclaim that obesity was caused by the lack of the right kind of dietary fats and the wrong kind of carbohydrates in her book Beyond Pritikin in 1998, where she wrote that the fat-free, carb-rich diet model was creating metabolic syndrome, sugar cravings, and fatigue. Always ahead of her time, she has set the pace for new health protocols over the last 2 decades with a myriad of breakthrough books including Get the Sugar Out, Guess What Came to Dinner, Parasites and Your Health, Your Body Knows Best, the New York Times bestseller Before the Change, The Fast Track Detox Diet, and Fat Flush for Life. A savvy and dynamic speaker, Ann Louise has appeared on 2020, Dr. Phil, The View, Good Morning America, and The Early Show. Her work has been featured in a myriad of national publications ranging from Time and Newsweek to Glamour, InStyle, and the Oprah magazine. Today, she continues to dedicate herself to carving out new landmarks in holistic health and healing. Her latest book, the highly acclaimed Zapped, is a step-by-step manual for fortifying the body, detoxifying the home, and protecting yourself from the invisible hazards of electropollution. Welcome to the summit, Ann Louise.
Well, thank you, Carla. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. I am so excited. Wow, what a background do you have?
Well, thank you. Thank you. And now we're moving into uncharted territory when we talk about the EMF.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. New stuff for a lot of people to take in, for sure. But not you.
Well, I had been familiarized with EMFs and the perils of electropollution way back in the 1980s when I read a book called Cross Currents, The Promise of Electromedicine, and that was by Dr. Robert Becker, who was a very much, I'd say, Carla, a pioneering researcher, and he was considered back then to be a leading expert in biological electricity. And this man was so ahead of his time that he was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize. He was an orthopedic surgeon, to be exact, and spoke about all of the emerging problems we were having because we were surrounded by all of these man-made frequencies, these energies from power lines, from radar and microwave ovens. And now we've seen in this day and time we're even more exposed to these man-made frequencies, and I believe that they're creating problems that we have simply not recognized.
Okay, so, when we were speaking earlier and getting to know each other, you mentioned the reason why you started working in the health field in the first place. So, and you're, when I read in your bio just now, you've been into a lot of things that people are getting savvy to nowadays, like the, fat and carbs and, looking at the body in a more functional way, and things that we just weren't really talking about then. But now, most recently, you're investigating, and you have investigated and written a book about electromagnetic fields in particular. And can you just talk about that for a minute? Like, what made you start this whole journey into uncovering things that people just weren't talking about?
It's almost like having a sixth sense that there's something that is the underlying cause of all of these symptoms that nobody has been recognizing. And I was seeing so many people, Carla, that I began noting what their symptoms were, came up with my own hypotheses, and then found through the literature that what I was suspecting was true. And so it's simply, wanting to really heal people and figure out those underlying causes that maybe hadn't been identified. And that might have been the parasites among us, the fungus, the mold, and now this unseen invader, which is the electromagnetic pollution that surrounds all of us. So what had happened after, writing all my books, I'm the author of 30 books on different aspects of health and healing. I was finding that for the past 15 years in my clinical practice, even using some of those underlying causes, whether it was too much sugar, not enough fiber, not the right kinds of fat, too many carbohydrates, the diet wasn't enough to really heal people. And I had started seeing this very strange constellation of symptoms that simply defied diagnosis, and even resisted a lot of my other tailor-made diets and supplements and so forth. And that's when I had to start looking into the environment and figuring that there was a new environmental hazard out there, the EMFs among us, that perhaps was the underlying cause that could solve many of my puzzling case histories. I wrote about it in Zapped and then found that the electromagnetic effect was really affecting and zapping us much more than we imagined, because it didn't go away the way the sugar cravings went away, or your ability to walk away from secondhand smoke, or even problems like asbestos. This particular situation that surrounds us is with us 24/7, and it's one that nobody wants to talk about. I can tell you it's not a popular topic because we love our gadgets and we feel we can't live without them.
Yeah, and too, I mean, what you just said earlier, unseen. Like these, food we can see, we can taste, we can, tummy trouble, blah, blah. We can't see electromagnetic fields. So would you just tell our listeners what electromagnetic fields are?
Well, the electromagnetic fields are actually energy fields that are emanated and come from a variety of sources. We find that microwave radiation is coming to us from cell phone antennas, from radar, from wireless networks, from portable phones, from wireless speakers, from baby monitors, from wireless mice and keyboards, and even these smart meters that are in the house. And then you get other fields that are coming from your home appliances, or even indoor wiring and plumbing, maybe outdoors from power lines, and sometimes even from transformers and what they call stray currents on underground water lines. That's where your EMFs, specifically electric and magnetic fields, are emanating from. And then there can be ground current, which comes into the home on plumbing fixtures. We're surrounded by these elements, and there is an actual electromagnetic spectrum where you can see the longest and shortest and slowest frequencies, which are referred to as extremely low frequencies, or ELF. So you've got your bands of ELF, your radio frequencies, your microwaves, your infrared, your visible light, your ultraviolet frequencies, and then your ionizing radiation, which we're all aware of is very dangerous. And that's the frequencies that we're getting from X-rays or CAT scans. So this, again, is invisible. Many of us can't see, can't taste, but we're feeling the effects in a variety of very strange ways, because these electromagnetic fields that are very subclinical, shall we say, they can't accurately be measured, but they're very much felt by those of us that are electromagnetically sensitive, kind of allergic to electricity, and they have biological effects that have been noted by a number of very courageous and brave independent scientists.
Okay. So EMFs are dangerous. I mean, obviously, from what you're saying. And you did give us a little bit as a reason to why they're dangerous, or I guess so, what they do in the body. Can you give us a little bit more about what effects they have on our health, and how these issues are especially problematic for children and teens?
Well, basically what we've learned, and I've done a lot of research with regard to this, I think that what we're seeing is that the electromagnetic fields, which are highly biologically active, they don't actually heat the body the way an ionizing radiation or the X-rays do, but the cells in your body really react to these EMFs as potentially harmful, and they shut down. And so it's almost like having a toxic chemical or a heavy metal in the environment. And your DNA very specifically can recognize these fields at very low levels of exposure, and the DNA becomes tainted. The DNA breaks and can't even reproduce itself. So on a very basic level, this is affecting us. A number of scientists have suggested that exposure to EMFs, or even wireless, your wireless phone, your cable phones, your computers, anything that is wireless, very specifically the wireless router, as well as the smart meters in the house, have the ability to change cell membrane function. And we have found that there are major changes in calcium metabolism where you start to lose calcium from the cells, and all of this starts to scramble communication between your cells. So you've got problems in terms of cell membrane function, and then the EMFs themselves, they produce what we call heat shock proteins, so as if heating were occurring when it is not, and all of this breaks DNA. It creates blood-brain barrier leaks. It increases free radicals. It increases cellular stress, premature aging, sometimes learning impairments, headaches, fatigue, sleeping disorders, melatonin impairment. And Carla, there are dozens of studies that have found that even the lowest levels of these EMFs can depress the body's production of melatonin, which is very important because melatonin, to me, is a hormone. It's considered to be the Dracula hormone because its production peaks at night, and it helps us sleep, it protects us from disease, and it was first noted that melatonin was affected by EMFs when studies began surfacing that found that night workers experienced higher rates of breast cancer than those who held down regular daytime jobs from 9 to 5, for example. And we now know that melatonin can increase the body's effectiveness of its own killer cells, which then fight off foreign invaders. So it's very important that we have enough melatonin because it bolsters the entire immune system, and it increases the antioxidant activity of glutathione, which is perhaps the most important antioxidant in the system. That's specifically anti-inflammatory, and it helps to repair cells. And so all of this is very critical because we see such a growing proliferation of all these immunosuppressive diseases that I think may be connected to this melatonin suppression. So all of this then kind of circles back to children and teens who aren't sleeping the way they should. They've got all kinds of electronic equipment in their rooms, and it's not just the blue lights that are emanating from the electronic equipment, but it's also the energy. It's the biological effect of some of the energy waves that are coming through, the non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation that most parents are just completely unaware of. And it's a shame because you've got very erudite and very austere and very impressive organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as the Canadian Society of Pediatrics, that have been very clear in terms of how many hours they think infants and children and teens should be exposed to technology. And they have stated unequivocally that from the age of 0 to 2 years, children should not have any exposure to technology. That's 0. So you can't be taking your kid on a walk and having that smartphone right near his head. And then for 3 to 5 years, that time should be restricted to about 1 hour a day. And from 6 to 18 years, technology should be restricted to an exposure of 2 hours per day. And that's almost impossible given the fact that so many schools are now going wireless. And so children and youth, they're probably using about 5 times the recommended amount of technological advances than we used, and many of them are then, they're facing immunosuppressing and life-threatening diseases. And I hate to be, so paranoid about this, but when you start reading the research and the literature that nobody's talking about because we have such major cell phone and telecommunication industries in this country, then it becomes really a little off-putting in terms of all this. And I think I shared with you that there was a presentation that was done in September of 2008. It was held at the Royal Society in London, and it showed that children and teenagers are about 5 times more likely to come down with some type of brain cancer if they use mobile phones.
Wow.
And this risk may in fact be underestimated because the studies that were used don't show the risk of phone use over many years. And so there's a major risk to young people who are using cordless phones at probably 5 times a greater risk, or they're incurring a 5 times greater risk of certain types of brain cancers, and ADD and ADHD and all of those issues that we're seeing with kids, as well as autism, which I think may also be connected to the use of all of the technology and maybe even ultrasounds during pregnancy. So there's a lot to be said about this, and Harvard University just published some research that is connecting the rise in autism with the proliferation of all of these electromagnetic fields that are truly part and parcel of our 21st century environment.
Mm. And so have you seen any studies about infertility and the use of having your cell phone in your pocket? And
well, there's certainly a decrease in sperm mobility and motility among men if they keep their cell phone in their front pocket. Yeah, so we've seen that as well. And you really shouldn't be keeping any kind of not just phone, but I wouldn't be keeping my laptop on my lap, because wherever you're keeping a wireless device, you're in fact irradiating that part of the body.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and then I just want to stop and go, and we were talking about specifically for children and teens and why this might affect them more. So can you explain the physiology behind why electromagnetic fields can actually affect children more profoundly than adults?
Well, they're affected much more profoundly because they're not just little adults.
Right.
I mean, they're not just little adults. They're undeveloped human beings at this point. And then I think where the real problem comes into play is that their brains and their nervous systems are underdeveloped. And so because the brain and the skull and that whole area is so permeable and is so fluid with ions and water, that those become conducting elements to the electromagnetic energy, so they become much more subject to adverse effects. And I think we're seeing that in terms of the great degree of ADD, ADHD, behavioral symptoms, and so forth. It's almost as if our kids have been exposed to digital dementia, so to speak. And I believe that term has been used quite a bit. So we have found that studies even suggest that a cell phone call that will last just about 2 minutes can cause brain hyperactivity. And that brain hyperactivity and over response can persist for at least an hour in children.
Wow.
So I guess what we think is that because children are growing so rapidly and their cells are dividing at breakneck speed, that the more cells that divide, the greater the risk for damage at certain critical junctures. And because we have seen that EMFs also cause breaks in the blood-brain barrier, children are simply more permeable, and that's because of their higher concentration of the ions in the fluid in their brains themselves. And so having any kind of breach in the blood-brain barrier allows all kinds of toxins as well as oxidative stress to start to further damage nerve tissue, and then it has adverse effects on brain hormones like dopamine and serotonin. And the idea here is that it's not just children who may be exposed, but they're exposed even before they're born, because they can be exposed to the pollution that a mother absorbs through her cell phone use, or to exposure to high EMFs at home or on the job. And so it's very important that you are careful, especially during pregnancy. And I have to tell you that there was a 2008 published study that showed, I think they worked with more than 13,000 children, and it found that women who use a cell phone 2 or 3 times a day while they're pregnant are more likely to have kids with behavioral problems and difficulty controlling their emotions. And so in the same way that you protect your baby from toxic exposures during pregnancy, you're not going to want to take x-rays during pregnancy. You don't want to use a lot of nail polish remover. I think it's vital that you protect your baby from electropollution, as it can impact the kid's nervous system long before birth. And so most importantly to me, you've got to curtail heavy-duty cell phone use during pregnancy. And it has been related, by the way, to a risk of miscarriage and birth defects. So all of that comes into play, especially when you're pregnant, and then making sure that your kids simply are not playing, with your smartphone just as a little entertainment piece. And it's very difficult. I mean, to say this seems almost sacrilegious when you see how prolific technology is today. Mm-hmm. And that you keep kids, playing, and they've got their little iPads, and you keep them really entertained, with videos and so forth. But we think that all of this is creating, some sort of real difficulty in brain function and in terms of nervous system function. And I think that if you take a look at your child's brain on EMFs, as I have, then you're going to see how the rates of autism and learning disabilities have absolutely soared in the last 20 years. It's something like 1 in 50 right now. Mm-hmm. And so much of that really mirrors and matches the proliferation of all the electromagnetic fields, which is about 100 million times more than our grandparents were surrounded with.
Yeah. Can you explain that term again? I just want to go back to that term you said, digital dementia. I had never heard that before. And that is, when you need to just put a word or a phrase or you need to name something and it goes, whoa, it just resonates with you. So can you just explain what that term is used to mean?
Well, it's the overexposure to technology, which starts to really affect the way a child interacts with the environment, with other human beings, and becomes really addicted to the internet, to the cell phone, to technology, to the effect that many social skills are starting to become very deficient and very lacking. So I see it just in terms of these kids that are interacting with their phones 24/7, but you also see it with adults, to be quite honest with you, when you're going out to dinner and everybody puts their cell phone on the table and starts to text one another, at the table, rather than interacting with one another. So there's a lot to be said, that may have nothing to do with the aberrant radiation and the non-ionizing, but nonetheless biologically active non-ionizing radiation. It's just you're interacting with a machine, and many of our social skills start to decline. Mm-hmm. So that's really problematic, and maybe that's the reason that so many other countries do not allow children to use cell phones. I mean, they have seen that it's not just the brain cancer risk, but that they're simply more physiologically sensitive to the energy, and it affects the way that they relate with other human beings. So all this is a really big deal as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, you know what? I would agree. I mean, you look at, they're sort of addictive, like these devices. Well, actually, not sort of, they are. And so you have that on top of the fact that they're actually physically altering, DNA and bodily functions, and, creating all kinds of havoc in the body and disease, and it's compounded by that not only there's this addictive element, and there's a social element as well. So it's really big. And so when you said earlier that you don't want to be doom and gloom, I don't know what the words you used, but this whole seriousness and make it, but really this is a truly big issue that our children have to deal with, especially with everybody thinking kids will be kids, and it's become part of just being a child in the world, having a device. Everybody's got one. I am an advocate of playing outside and talking to your friends, that kind of thing, and I'm always talking like that, and with the kids that I'm around, whenever I'm around them. But I still see those very kids in a group texting each other while they're together, or hunkered over some kind of device or other, and everybody's got their own and are doing their own thing, and it's like they're just sucked right in, and it's constant. It's a constant inundation of these EMF radiation.
Well, it is, and then if you start reading the research, and a lot of this I've written about in greater depth in Zapped, you'll see that the cells actually become interrupted. The cellular communication between one another becomes interrupted. Yeah. And so your cells get overwhelmed by all kinds of messages from inside and outside the body, because without enough calcium, remember this creates calcium leakages in the cell membranes, then all of the neurotransmitters become very scrambled. and then chemicals start pouring in from your ruptured cells that damage your cellular DNA, and then this starts to disrupt normal cell division, and it creates oxidative stress that further damages DNA and many other physical processes. So all of this has a domino effect, so to speak. And you can talk about it, and then people go back to just texting one another, which is a better way of communicating certainly than by using a little microwave oven, which is what a cell phone is, right around your brain, near your head, for example. And I have to tell you that all of this really drove home with me because I developed what they call a salivary gland benign tumor, although I didn't know what it was until we had it removed. I had been living on a cell phone. So I'm kind of a reformed cell phone addict, to be quite honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was living on my cell phone, I was doing interviews 24/7. I was communicating with it. It was entertaining me. I mean, that was my mode of communication, which is true with just about everybody in this day and time. And there were no smartphones back then. This was in the early 2000, 2003, 4, and 5. But I was living on it and using it specifically on one side of my head. And then when I developed this it was right beneath the jawline. It was this little bump and lump that got bigger and bigger. And I thought, well, maybe it was a lymph node, but why should I have a lymph node there? I had it removed, and the surgeon at that point, this was 2005, didn't know what it was until the lab results came back, and they said it was a benign parotid gland tumor. And then when I started researching my book, I learned that there was quite a lot of research that had come out, particularly by the Israelis, that showed that extreme use of the cell phone on one side of the head created a near epidemic of these benign as well as malignant parotid gland tumors. And so I knew that I was very hypersensitive to electromagnetics. Even before then, I would go into stores and then feel a little uncomfortable when the fluorescent lights started blinking on and off. But I never realized the extent that my own system had become really allergic to the digital age, so to speak. And that's kind of true with a lot of us. I mean, it's very interesting because when you start looking at some of the symptoms of electro-hypersensitivity that I believe our kids have, whether it's numbness in the fingers, feelings of warmth, facial flushing, headaches, dizziness, nauseousness, deafness, blurred vision, blistering skin. Severely affected people cannot even use a cell phone at all at this point because they get heated so prolifically from the use of the cell phone. It'll heat up the ear and heat up a certain side of the head. So I'm finding that many of us, are allergic but aren't realizing where the source is coming from, and can even be allergic to those high, or they're called the energy-efficient light bulbs, that many of us see, the CFLs, the compact fluorescent lights. So all of that gives off a kind of form of radiation, and many symptoms that we're experiencing are very identical to radio wave sickness that we've identified as far back as the 1970s. So they're neurological implications. There are implications in terms of the cardiac system and the respiratory system and even the digestive system in terms of enlarged thyroid and abdominal pain and the eyes and dehydration. And nosebleeds are very much connected, they say, to EMFs as well. So it's really scary. And if you're traveling in a car, with your child and they're playing with your cell phone or they want to make calls, that's not the best place to make calls because you're in a vehicle that is metallic, and all of that starts to concentrate some of the radioactive or the non-ionizing radiation waves. If you're in an airplane, it's the same thing with the metals. The waves just start bouncing off of the metal, and then they can concentrate the exposure of some of that non-ionizing radiation, which again is very biologically active. And that's why we get so tired on airplanes in this day and time. I don't think it's just regular jet lag. I think a lot of this is EMF overexposure. So it takes you twice as long to get over an airplane flight as it did 10 to 20 years ago.
Right. Wow. And that's very serious stuff. And, like what we were mentioning before, you can't see this, right? You can't, and people, we just think, it's jet lag or I'm just tired or, all this stuff, I'm not really sure why. And so, I just got a headache for some reason or another. And so it's really hard to, understand that it's like this is something that's real. And, even if we could think and shift our thinking about EMFs and our exposure to EMFs, like liken it to something like smoking or, where it's just polluting your environment. And so I like it when you use words like allergic, right? So you're allergic to EMFs, because that really makes it feel and seem like a real thing. You can be allergic to it. You can have a sensitivity to it. EMFs, EMF pollution, using that word pollution, because those are all terms that we take as something that's physically real in our environment.
Yes, and what's really disconcerting is that other countries are much far ahead of the game than we are. They're much more aware about all of these issues, particularly when it comes to children and protecting children. So I think that what we're moving towards here is a realization that we could be hypersensitive to the electromagnetic world that's around us. And there is a variety of symptoms that are connected to electromagnetics. I mean, it can affect the heart rate, it can affect the eyes, the ears, the brain, the skin. It's just about every area of the body is affected, so you never know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you see the proliferation of brain tumors that we're not talking about the way that we did. However, for those of us that have friends that work on Wall Street that are forever surrounded by computers and phones and all ears, then you know that there's an overexposure. And I think that's what the problem is. And then there are no safe havens because, again, there might have been a problem years ago with lead or asbestos or tanning beds or cigarettes, and you could simply remove yourself from a certain environment and you weren't exposed. What's happening now, however, is that you've got the exposure 24/7 if you've got your wireless router that's plugged in and not disabled at night, or if you're living in a home that has a smart meter. So you've got all of those exposures, and that's why it's more important now than ever to really support yourself with antioxidants, perhaps with melatonin, or with this new type of, it's not really new, but it's an old remedy that we are now researching and have some science behind, and that's the whole concept of earthing, whereby you're protecting your system from these low-frequency electromagnetic fields by neutralizing some of the positive charges with the negative electrons from the earth. And it's interesting because earthing has taken off as quite a phenomenon, and I had the ability to, in 2010, I believe, when the Earthing book came out, to really review that and learn firsthand about the healing response that it takes in the body, and it starts when a person becomes grounded, and whether that means standing or sitting on the earth, or grounded using electrodes that are placed on the soles of the feet, or certain types of sheets that you can sleep with. It's really interesting because this is able to help pain, it's able to speed wound healing, it's able to decrease inflammation, and it takes only 20 minutes a day for a person to really get that healing response when they start to be grounded.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are lots of things that can be done. Yeah, this is a big deal that has just taken off, and rather than focus on EMFs, and I remember talking to the lead author, Clint Ober, about this, who was in the telecommunications industry early on. He said, people are not going to give up their gadgets. I can just tell you everything is going to be digitized. Digitized in the coming years. This was 2010. So telling people to do without their cell phones or their iPads, as well as their routers, and to live far away from cell phone towers. He says it ain't going to happen. So we've got to be very protective and very positive, and then protect them with all of these antioxidant-rich electrons, which he believes is a major deficiency. He believes most people are simply electron deficient, which would provide you with the ability to neutralize all of the kind of toxic elements that you're getting when you're exposed. So I include a little bit about earthing in my book. I talk about that certainly on some of the websites that we have that are connected to Zapped, ruzapped.com. And I have found that that's been very helpful, because what you can do at night is to make sure that in your bedroom, as well as that of your children, that you remove all electronic equipment, and that you never sleep with your cell phone. I mean, your cell phone just shouldn't be your alarm clock. You don't want to have any of these digitized and digital gadgets near your head. You want to make sure that you're as far away as possible, make sure that there is no frequency of use, and that the duration of time is as is as less as can be, reasonably expected, because it's really prolific use and constant barraging of the system that's the problem, where you don't have a chance to rest and rejuvenate and regenerate, which is what you need to do when you sleep at night, which is why I use grounded sheets.
Right. So the proximity is extremely important, how close it is to you, and the duration of use. And also, too, you mentioned...
And the frequency.
And the frequency. And so you also talk about, we're talking a lot about cell phones, but what about cordless phones?
Some of the research, there was a small study that was done, and we have found that the cell phones with individuals that have problems in terms of their heart can be very deleterious to arrhythmia. And so heart rate variability, thickness of the blood, your problems that people are having in terms of very consistent beating of the heart may in fact be more deleteriously affected with cellular phones and cordless phones rather than your cell phone, because that's like having a mini cell phone tower in the privacy of your own home.
Yeah. And many of them are right beside people's heads,
They are.
Yeah.
And many of our, senior citizens simply shouldn't have a cordless phone. And then you say, well, what are they supposed to have? And that's why I'm so sorry. I mean, I'm talking to you right now on a corded phone.
You're on a landline, right?
I'm on a landline, but you have to be careful, because there's some kinds of landlines or corded phones that actually look as if they're landlines, and they're deck phones. So you have to be very careful to make sure that these are not cordless phones in disguise.
Okay. Yeah.
And so you've got to be very astute to all these things, because none of this is going away. You just have to learn how to shield yourself. You have to learn how to put smart guards on your smart meters. You have to learn how to use the earthing equipment or the earthing sheets in terms of sleep. And you've got to really reduce your exposure whenever you can. And by all means, there's certain kinds of cell phone etiquette, I call it, cell phone or cordless phone etiquette, that you need to use when you're traveling. I mean, you really shouldn't be using the cell phone as a communication device, at least besides texting, unless it's absolutely essential. Mm-hmm. And if you do need to use something, you should be using the speakerphone when possible to keep the phone away from your body and your skull. And if that's not possible, then the other thing is a plastic ear tube earpiece that reduces the radiation to the brain. Mm-hmm. And all of that is available in many of our EMF protective stores these days. And I'd say that the other issue that you need to do is just make sure that your cordless phone is not that deck phone, which is a digitally enhanced communications technology phone that you'll find, because then you're using something right directly near your brain. Yeah. And you're going to want to also make sure that you use a headset whenever possible. They don't always provide the best protection, but they certainly provide some protection, and that's where the air tube headset comes into play, probably with an additional extension cord. That would be my recommendation. And then, of course, don't allow your kids to use the cell phones as much as possible.
Well, yeah.
And if you're pregnant, don't carry one around with you, and never put that cell phone in your bra. You don't want to carry that around. We're seeing all kinds of tumors that are the shape of the cell phone that are emanating from that kind of usage. I wouldn't use the cell phone when you're driving, because you're really exposing yourself to much higher levels of this non-ionizing radiation, because you're constantly having to make an ongoing reconnection to the towers, and you're in a metal environment, so that you've got all these internal reflection devices that are just reflecting right back to you. So there's quite a lot that needs to be done here, in terms of your habits, and just like brushing your teeth on a daily basis, it's just become part and parcel of life. Then you just have to watch yourself in terms of some of your cell phone etiquette and so forth. And I would say, too, that you should always keep that cell phone charged. If you're going to use it, make sure to keep it charged, because when the signal is not strong, then the phone emits a lot more radiation. I would also say that you've got to turn off your mobile phone devices when they're not in use, or you just switch to airplane mode as best you can. Make believe you're traveling on an airplane and switch to airplane mode. Mm-hmm. And you should also turn off your Bluetooth or your Wi-Fi when not in use. And I would not frequently use a wireless tablet or a laptop if possible, because again, wherever these agents are placed, wherever these tablets or laptops are placed, that's where your body is going to become irradiated, and so that's not a good idea.
Right.
And at night, we always turn off, the wireless router. I think that's very important. And that also goes for making sure that your microwave oven, if in fact you still have a microwave,
I don't.
Is not healthy. Well, we don't either. But for those that do, you really shouldn't be in the same room when you're microwaving something. I mean, isn't that something? We've measured microwave ovens, and they all leak because some of the doors don't close as successfully as they used to, especially with frequent use. So there's always a leakage, and that can really be affecting the eyes or the ears.
Right, and also microwaves also ruin the food. So.
Well, it affects the enzymes of the food, so there's another nutritional reason for that. And when you talk about nutrition, that's why it's all important to make sure that there's enough vitamin C in the diet, a lot of magnesium because of the way in which calcium is lost from the cell membrane. So you want to make sure that you're supplementing with magnesium that allows the calcium to stay in the right place. And you also want to make sure that you have enough selenium, potassium, sulfur, manganese, chromium, and if you're not sleeping well at night, then taking a little melatonin, maybe 1 to 3 milligrams would be very, very helpful because, as I say, electropollution seriously reduces the body's production of melatonin, and that's exceedingly important in terms of protecting your system against cancer. I'm also a big believer, certainly, in vitamin D and making sure that you have enough other antioxidants in the diet that will help to protect against the positive free radicals that you're getting from all different sources in terms of the electromagnetics and, the toxins in the environment and the chemicals. So this is just one more element, in terms of your environment that needs to be protected against. And when you have people come into the house that check for mold or check for radon, they should also do an EMF sweep of your house and measure and see if there are any fields that are coming from unexpected sources, and then you can use protective shielding devices or moving around your furniture so that you're not as close to some of these emanating devices as possible. The refrigerator has a very large magnetic field because of the motor, for example, so you want to be very careful that you don't have a couch on the other side of the wall where you place your refrigerator.
Yeah, because it passes through the wall. A wall is not a barrier for EMFs.
It definitely passes through the wall.
Yeah.
And I have a chart in the book which is very interesting because it gives the kind of breakdown of the measurements of the fields and the magnetic field measurements that we find with some of our most common devices. And you'd be very surprised that hair dryers, particularly larger hair dryers, provide a very large magnetic field, as do electric shavers and coffee makers, and sometimes electric slow cookers and food processors and garbage disposals, but that refrigerator motor is one of the highest. And you want to be careful that whenever you have any of these appliances that are plugged in, you want to unplug them. They can still be emanating fields. So you're not just getting this from the wireless or radio frequency fields from some of your computers or your phones or your cordless phone, but also from electricity itself and electrical appliances. I mean, I remember when you used to go into your grandmother's house and she'd always be unplugging all of the devices. They had this internal knowing that this wasn't a healthy thing to do, and we need to do the same. And if you're asleep at night and you've got a lot of electrical appliances in your bedroom, you want to disconnect, you want to unplug at night to make sure that none of that is being activated and affecting you.
Right. And so what's a safe distance from a refrigerator?
Oh, I'd say about 6 to 8 feet.
Right. I mean, your child's bedroom could be right beside the kitchen or right above the kitchen, upstairs. So all those, like, furniture placement, all that stuff needs to be taken into account, correct?
Yes, we called it electronic feng shui, and I talk about it in the book where you can zap-proof your house, and you go into the bedroom and you see what's in the bedroom. You go into the kitchen, you go into the great room, you go into the bathroom, you go into your office or your den, your living room, family rooms, etc., and you can just have advanced zap-proofing where you just start moving things around and you're conscious of it.
So if people are listening and going, I don't know where the heck to start, I don't know what to do, this is very overwhelming to me, like what, they can get all that information from your book. And it's all laid out.
It's all laid out, and because I never had a real scientific understanding of all of this, and I've tried to explain it in layman's terms, it's much more easy for a layperson to understand it. I mean, this is not woo-woo stuff. This is highly researched, and the problem is that you're not hearing about all the independent studies because the cell phone industry is not investing in any of the independent studies. So that's why you don't hear about it. And those independent and very courageous scientists, as I mentioned before, that are well published, like Henry Lai at the University of Washington, or even Dr. Martin Blank, you can look them up online and see all of the information that they have where they prove the biological effects of some of these frequencies and how deleterious it is to the system. And these people have run across a lot of problems from the cell phone industries themselves, so they're very brave, and we need to support them. And it's just one more thing to take a look at, and you just want to make sure that you're doing everything right in terms of your children, your unborn child, and even in your home, and that's where healthy food comes into play. You're not going to want to have a lot of junk food. You want the right kind of fats that will fortify the cell membrane so that the body can be fortified against these things, and that's where the right kind of oils come into play. Saturated fats, your coconut oil, your high omega-3 fats from your fish oil and your flax oil, all that's important because the right kind of fat can also hold calcium in suspensions. And we want that so that you're not affected with the calcium leaking that goes on in the cell membrane when it starts to rupture.
Right. And so that's why, I mean, this whole premise of the summit itself is that, there's not only one element of health that we need to be, concerned with our children and our teens. There are a lot of things that go, but they all work together, right? They all have a part in that. Yeah.
Well, they do all have a part in it, but this is the big elephant that's dancing in the middle of the room. This is what nobody wants to talk about, that everybody wants to ignore. When you're seeing rates of autism soar, and everybody thinks it's the vaccines, no, it's the molds, no, it's the allergies. Well, what really people are exposed to 24/7 is technology, and you have to be convinced that there's a biological deleterious effect, and there's nothing that we're doing in terms of the government that's really protecting you. It's every woman, man, child, and unborn child on his own is really what's going on here. And that's why I think it's so important to fight Wi-Fi in schools and communities and even at home as best you can. It's why you need to text rather than call and use a safe headset and no phones in the bedroom. And then you teach the kids to keep the phones away from their body while they're turned on, because all of those incoming calls and the texts, by the way, they cause this burst of radio frequency that can penetrate the body. So you need to stash a phone or a purse. You need to stash your phone probably in your purse or a backpack. You simply don't want to have it on your body. That's really what the element is.
Right. And also, too, I'd like to return to this idea of earthing because, that's something that seems to be a simple thing to be able to do, and it's protective, and it also is healing. And so, I guess when I was reading about earthing, you sort of think about when you're on the beach, right? You go on the beach and you kick off your shoes and you're by the water in the sand and you feel amazing. And that's really what it's doing. There's actually a physiological process that's happening, a healing that's happening, and I suppose we could be considered antennas, right?
Well, we are antennas because there's so much water and so many minerals, and those are conductive substances that are in our system. Yeah, very much so, and that's why earthing can be so regenerative, specifically with the sand and in the beach and in the country. So you want to be able to do that if you can on a daily basis, but for those of us that live in certain environments, we can't do that, and that's why there are now these devices that you can use. There are pads when you're sitting at your computer, there are mats that you can use, there are wristbands that you can use, there are sheets that you can use that have conductive silver threads. You can just plug it into the wall in terms of the electric grounding aspect, that's in the house, the electric ground, so to speak, or you can ground it, directly outside. There are all kinds of ways to do that. And the research is pretty incredible and pretty impeccable. Clint Ober has invested quite a lot of time, energy, and money to get his double-blind, placebo-controlled tests out there, and we now know that there is definitely science behind the mechanism of earthing. And he suggests that the reason so much of this is needed is because of the revolution of the 1960s, in which we stopped wearing leather-soled shoes and we are now using plastics and all kinds of rubber soles, which are not conductive the way the leather was. And so, in effect, we become unconnected. We become disconnected to the earth, and when we become reconnected, your whole bodily system works much better. The heart starts to beat better. The thyroid functions much better. I mean, look at all the problems we have with thyroid in this day and time. The electromagnetics in the environment definitely have an effect. When you start to earth, everything starts to normalize, including your melatonin levels with the earthing and grounding, as well as cortisol levels. So your body isn't as much under constant stress, the stress and strain of the stress proteins that are affected when you're exposed to electromagnetics. So it's very protective. It's almost like having a protective bubble. So I've got my foot on one of those grounding mats even as we speak.
Actually, I have my hand on one. Isn't that funny?
Yeah, right now. Well, then this is what you do. It just becomes part of your lifestyle.
Yeah.
And of course, then you're sleeping on, the sheets that we have, or the mats that you can use, or the pads that we can use as well. So it's very interesting what's going on, and I think that, all of this grounding information and certainly the technology that's been kind of revived is important, and we have to be very grateful for Clint Ober for coming up with so many of these things. And he now has, I think, mattresses that are grounding mattresses, which I think are very interesting.
I spoke to him about, potentially grounding our house, right? Because and he said that, the technology was quite a ways away. It would cost quite a bit of money right now. But, when we were building our house, I had spoken to him and talked about some of these things because, there are ways that you can set up how you live in your home, like you were saying, the feng shui and those things can be done, if you can research it and get a bit of information. Yeah, so
all that can be done, as well as placing the furniture in certain locales, making sure that you're not over a lot of fans. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which we can protect ourselves, and you just do this as naturally as you would eat the right kind of foods on a daily basis. It just becomes part and parcel of what your life is like. But, when you take a look at what's in the house these days, you'll see all of the devices that are electrically or digitally or wirelessly now driven. And it's just amazing, because if you went into your grandparents' house, there might be 20 or 30 items that you could name that have some sort of an electrical connection. But if you go into our homes in this day and time and just take a little tour, as I do through the book, and take you on a digital tour, you're seeing all the proliferation of so many devices. I mean, we're surrounded and dependent. That's really what's kind of scary.
Yeah. And I just want to mention two things just to make sure that we don't skip over anything without being clear. Earlier you mentioned a protective device called, like, not a protective device, but something you could use in instead of, the headset or putting the phone by your head. You said an air tube headset. So I want to make that clear. When you said headset, you didn't mean the traditional headset with the wires. There is such a thing as an air tube headset, which actually I'm using right now. And, you might not have the sound exactly the same, but they still work really well. And so it's an air tube. It's not a traditional headset that you were saying to use, right?
It's a plastic air tube earpiece, yes. Yeah. So if that's what you're using, yes. So that there's like a little bubble thing that's there, and you're not directly connected to the phone through that.
And the traditional headsets, you are actually, and it's going directly into your head.
It is going directly into your head. So that's not what we want. We want to get all of this away from your body and away from your head, most specifically and most directly as much as possible.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. So there is a lot of information here. I also, too, want to, you were talking about Clint Ober. He wrote a book called Earthing. That's what it's called, right? So for anybody who wants to look into his work.
Yes, and I talk about Earthing and Zapped.
Okay, Zapped. Okay. And so is there anything else that you'd like to mention? There's a lot of information here, and I think that you've done such a fabulous job of covering all of the main issues and giving our listeners, our parents and caregivers, some really, really good tips and empowering tips on how to protect our kids from the EMFs in the environment. And actually, maybe even some of the people might not have known that this was even a real issue or a health concern in the first place. So that is amazing, and I thank you for all that. And so for people who really are kind of maybe even reeling from all this information, you can there are lots of resources to research, and one of them, and one of the best ones, would be your book called Zapped. And so, be sure to check into that, pick up a copy of Zapped, because Ann Louise goes into great detail about all of this and will really help you to get sorted. Is there anything else you'd like to suggest for research, or anything you'd like to tell us about what your next projects are, Ann Louise?
Well, the next projects are really kind of getting this information out as best that we can.
Yeah.
And I'm also going to suggest for people that really need the research in terms of all of the studies, there was a wonderful work that was first presented, I think it was 2009 when it came out, and it was updated in 2012, and that is the Bioinitiative report. And if you look online at bioinitiativereport.org, I believe is the URL, bioinitiativereport.org, you will see that there has been an enormous amount of documented studies that connect the EMFs that we're talking about, from the wireless devices to the electrical devices, and that all of this has been connected to a great variety of current diseases and disorders that we are now looking at.
Yeah.
And so I want to make that available for people. And I also want individuals to understand that in 2011, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer warned the world of risks from the radiation emitted by cell phones, from Wi-Fi and smart meters. I mean, they classed all of this as a Class 2B possible carcinogen. So this is being made known throughout the world, and many of our researchers, feel that sensitivity to these electromagnetic radiation emissions is the emerging health problem of our century, and that it is pretty imperative that parents, as well as practitioners and governments and schools, learn much more about it, because it's felt that human health stakes are significant. Some people consider this the greatest biological experiment of mankind, by the way.
Wow.
So we go to all different elements there. Yeah, and there are many prestigious organizations, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, the American Academy of Pediatrics, have all come out with mission statements and declarations about how so much of this is an important health issue, and it can cause acute and chronic health problems, and it's being looked at with more and more concern by healthcare practitioners everywhere. So to me, this is an emerging, or probably the emerging public health issue of our time, and that the human brain is especially susceptible to the environmental insults that are coming from all of these EMFs, and that's why I think we have an epidemic among children of decreased motor function, of hyperactivity, diminished cognition, diminished learning. That's where all this digital dementia is coming from in terms of the underdeveloped interpersonal skills, disjointed experiences, and even brain damage. So it is considered a new condition, digital dementia in children.
Wow.
It's been coined before. So I just need to say that all of that is there, because you'll go out into the world and see that all of this starts to be poo-pooed, and everybody says, oh, this is nothing. You've got naysayers or people that don't know science, and this is what they're saying, this is impossible. Just go online and take a look at Marty Blank's YouTube videos where he talks about how cell phones do damage, and he just wrote a magnificent book called Overpowered.
Okay.
So that's the type of thing you need to look at, which will show the DNA and how it breaks and how it's damaged and so forth. And it cannot repair itself because of this damage. And a lot of this was known way back in the 70s. Nothing was done about it. There's a lot of money involved. And you know, the communications industry, which is a $1 trillion industry, simply doesn't want all of this found out, but we really have to take our own matters of health into our own hands without being terribly paranoid and negative.
Yeah, great points. And if you're one of those, people that get it, you get it already, you just want to, get on with things and make a change, curbing use, knowing that cell phones are not toys, keeping the proximity from these devices far, a little further, the duration of use as little as possible, and consider, earthing and other products that help you to get grounded and help your body, and other health things such as, social, to speak to people, go and hang out with your friends, and instead of, texting and all that sort of thing. So all those things that go together for all of us who want to make some kind of change in that regard can really make a huge impact. And I thank you so much, Ann Louise, for all of your information. You are just so passionate about all this stuff. And, we could do like 20 interviews, I think, with all the stuff that you are an expert at. So I would love to do this again, maybe for the second Children's and Teen Health Summit.
We'll have some positive information at that point.
That'd be awesome.
Unfortunately, I hear myself and I say this is all gloom and doom, but something, it's not going to go away, and putting your head in the sand is not the answer. So we have to be very proactive and realize what we're fighting, what we're up against, and be as proactive about this as we were about lead and asbestos and tanning beds, as well as the GMO foods. To me, this is our GMO'd environment.
Well, I, for one, Ann Louise, as a warrior mama, appreciate your proactivity. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for being here with us, and I appreciate your time. Take care.
Bye-bye.